Ryzen CPUs were launched back in 2017 and brought us the well-known Zen architecture that came with an evolution of the hypertransport called Infinity Fabric. Nowadays it is used in all Zen CPUs, Threadripper and EPYC included, and even on the RDNA 3 GPUs that feature AMD's multi-chip module design. In terms of frequency, Infinity Fabric's frequency is in most times directly connected to your DDR RAM frequency. So for example, if you have DDR4 3200, DDR being an acronym for double data rate, means that your RAM's true frequency is in fact half of those 3200. In this case, 1600 MHz. And that happens because those 3200 are mega transfers per second and not megahertz. But that's a topic for another video, I guess. All recent AMD CPUs known so far use Infinity Fabric, meaning that usually when using those CPUs, higher RAM frequency means higher Infinity Fabric's frequency, and higher Infinity Fabric's frequency should technically lead to higher performance, as we have faster data transfers in between the CPU parts, like core and I/O dies, so again, lower latency, higher performance. The amount though depends on the Ryzen generation you are using. Older generations will get a bigger boost due to having higher inner latencies, while the newer generations seem to not benefit as much due to architectural improvements. The first and second generation Ryzen CPUs had kind of a limit, where you couldn't simply go above a certain RAM frequency due to the IMC, Integrated Memory Controller, and of course the low Infinity Fabric optimization. That limit was usually around DDR4 3200 in the early days and went up to DDR4 3400 with some BIOS updates when using Samsung B-Die kits. The third generation brought us the ability to use RAM frequency as high as DDR4 5000, but as soon as you went over DDR4 3800, the Infinity Fabric would decouple, and would now be half of your RAM's true frequency. So using DDR4 5000 would actually mean that your Infinity Fabric's frequency would be 1250 MHz instead of the usual 2500. Making it way lower than when using DDR4 3800 that would have an Infinity Fabric frequency of 1900 MHz, making it preferable to use DDR4 3800 with way tighter timings. With the 5th generation, inner latencies were reduced, the CCX core complexes were removed, and all cores were inside a CCD and able to access the full 32 MB of L3 cache, meaning that RAM and Infinity Fabric frequency wouldn't matter as much as before. We also had some BIOS and microcode updates that allowed the Infinity Fabric to go as high as 2000 MHz. Although the SoC voltage had to be increased a lot, and overall gains generally just wouldn't justify it. After some years, the 7th generation was released, featuring Zen 4 architecture and bringing lots of improvements alongside the use of DDR5. With this generation, the Infinity Fabric was improved, now running desynced from RAM frequency at 2000 MHz base, even if you're using the slowest kit in the market. But that doesn't really mean that the performance won't get better when using higher frequencies, as even though the Infinity Fabric's frequency is desynced, the memory controller frequency isn't. And higher RAM frequency means higher memory controller frequency, more bandwidth, and usually less latency, which in theory should lead to higher performance as well. And now we have the 9th generation featuring Zen 5 that was, in terms of RAM frequency, pretty similar to Zen 4, being limited to around DDR5 6000, which is AMD's recommended sweet spot, with some CPU's memory controller being able to handle up to DDR5 6600. And now we're in 2025 and DDR5 kits are quite cheap, with a decent DDR5 6000 32GB kit costing around $80, or DDR5 8000 kits like the one I'm using from VColor, the Xfinity model, costing around $160, making them quite affordable. The thing is, we now have CPUs with extreme amount of cache called X3D, with Intel following the same step for their next generation. And the higher amount of cache you have, the lower the number of transactions the RAM will have to do with the CPU, because you have more cache. So, do the newer Ryzen generations really benefit from having higher frequencies and tighter timings? And what about the X3D CPUs? Do they benefit as well? Let's find out. And well guys, now that you saw the intro that I made, and I know that it was a long intro, but I really wanted to make something interesting for you guys to see, and I know that lots of you already know what we were talking about because you are already keen into, or you're kind of tech savvy, I should say that way, but I still wanted to bring this information for the newer people that want to see it, or even for those that, even though they know what we're talking about, they just want to know more a bit about every generation of Ryzen CPUs, how they work in terms of Infinity Fabric, memory controllers, and so on. And in case you're new to the channel, this is Ancient Gameplays, I'm Fabio Pisco, and welcome to my channel. As for today's video, we're gonna do again DDR5 5600 versus 6000 versus 6200 versus 6400. But we're not only testing frequency, but also timings, in this case with improved subtimings. As I always say in my videos, improved subtimings matter much more than the CAS latency. CAS latency is great if you have a CL36 kit and you go to a 28 kit from 36 to 28, the performance will improve a bit in CPU-bound scenarios. But again, the most important thing and where you will notice the biggest difference is with improved subtimings. But then there's another question people make me all the time. What about my Ryzen CPU? I have a Ryzen 9000 series X3D or a Ryzen 7000 series X3D, so will that make any difference at all since I have 3D cache? Will the RAM frequency or timings do any difference at all? In this case scenario, we're gonna test the 9700X, Ryzen 7 9700X, and the Ryzen 9 7900 X3D. For you guys to see the difference in between a normal CPU and the CPU with a lot of 3D cache.
NANI? Riscas. Riscas.
And just because of that, let's go into today's sponsor. Today's video sponsor is GVG Mall, bringing you lots of software deals like Windows 10, Windows 11, Office 2019 or 2021 with a new Windows 11 design, and for all of these you can use my SKG discount code for 30% off, getting a Windows 11 serial key for $22 and a Windows 10 one for only $15. Then use the key on your Windows settings and you'll have an activated system. So, let's see. Starting with Banishers with Ghosts of New Eden and the Ryzen 7 9700X, we can see some interesting results, with a 5600 CL32 and a 6000 CL30 delivering the same results at 1080p and 1440p somehow, with a 6200 CL32 being a bit faster at both resolutions. But with a real difference coming when using improved subtimings, with a 6000 CL30 with improved subtimings being 10% faster at 1080p and 8% faster at 1440p versus the normal Expo mode, with higher frequencies of course, with tighter timings performing slightly better as well. As we move to the 7900 X3D though, the differences are basically null. And with this CPU I even pushed the memory to 6400 CL32, something that my 9700X couldn't achieve, and even in this case scenario, with or without improved subtimings, the difference is very small, with 6400 CL32 with improved subtimings and FCLK overclock to 2133 MHz being only 2% faster than the standard 6000 CL30 Expo kit. Assetto Corsa is a game that loves and needs a good CPU and RAM to perform at high FPS numbers, with the Ryzen 7 9700X delivering around the same performance even with 6200 CL32 RAM, but with improved subtimings delivering 9% better performance. It is interesting to note that at 1440p, even though all the configurations delivered a bit lower performance, DDR5600 was the only one suffering the most, maybe indicating lack of bandwidth or something. Although as we move to the Ryzen 9 7900X3D, we have loads of cache, so the memory frequency and timings make little difference, with all results being within the margin of error, I would say, with the only real difference maybe being in the 1% lows. Cyberpunk 2077 is an example of a game that can be 100% GPU-sided in some parts, but really CPU-heavy in others, with the Ryzen 7 9700X being completely stomped in this test and being able to deliver up to 14% better performance with the best configuration of 6200 CL32 improved subtimings versus the standard 6000 CL30. And remember that most kits will be able to do these by overclocking, so it's kind of free performance if you think about it. we can see difference even at 1440p, so it's a great improvement. And also in this game, even the Ryzen 9 7900 X3D shows a little difference, with the top tier configuration being around 5% faster, with the 1% lows improving at both 1080p and 1440p every time you increase the frequency or decrease the timings. And enabling ray tracing and FSR delivers interesting results. At 1440p, for example, we get GPU bottlenecked, that's why the results are all within the margin of error. But as the GPU is able to deliver more FPS, like at 1080p, we can see that DDR5600 gets quite slower than DDR5 6000, something that wasn't happening before, and this might be happening because with ray tracing we need way more bandwidth, and DDR5 5600 maybe just wasn't cutting it. The Ryzen 9 7900 X3D does mitigate the issue a bit with its X3D cache when speaking of DDR5 5600, but even here the difference is seen, but now mostly in terms of frequency, with DDR5 6400 CL32 being only 3% faster than DDR5 6000 CL30 in the averages, but again 10% faster in the 1% lows. In Call of Duty Black Ops 6 we're using the inbuilt benchmark and we're mostly GPU bottlenecked here, with the difference being really small performance-wise. And this means that in most situations you would be able to play with the Ryzen 7 9700X at over 180 FPS with no issues, even with slow RAM. And the same applies even more to the Ryzen 9 7900X 3D that delivers exactly the same results with the slowest or the fastest RAM configuration. We would mostly see some differences if I was pushing, let's say, over 300 FPS with medium settings, but this just shows that anything close to 200 FPS will be fine. When moving to Hogwarts Legacy, things go back to normal, with the Ryzen 7 9700X delivering very good results, with the improved subtimings making the biggest difference at 1080p, with DDR5 6000 being 6% faster with improved subtimings, and even at 1440p, when we're GPU bottlenecked for the most part, the improved subtimings can increase the 1% lows, which means that even though the average FPS will be around the same, you'll have a smoother gameplay. Although as we change to the Ryzen 9 7900X 3D, the average FPS changed very little, with the top configuration delivering only 3% better FPS than the lowest one, and with the 1% lows somehow being all around. Counter-Strike 2 is one of those titles where people want the maximum FPS they can get, and the Ryzen 7 9700X can deliver a good amount, delivering better performance with improved subtimings of course, but nothing really relevant I would say. And with the Ryzen 9 7900X 3D, RAM frequency and timings make even less difference in this game, with the 1% lows increasing slightly at 1080p and increasing by around 10 FPS at 1440p. Which might be happening due to the higher bandwidth requirements, I don't know. Still, no need to worry about RAM and frequency with an X3D CPU it seems. Spider-Man series on PC are known to be very demanding when it comes to CPU and RAM, at least if you want more than 60 FPS. At 1080p with the Ryzen 7 9700X, we get some performance increases when tweaking the subtimings and little performance increase when going from 6000 CL30 to 6200 CL32, although the difference gets mitigated when we use improved subtimings, making them deliver virtually the same performance. With the Ryzen 9 7900X 3D, the FPS are lower, which is actually a surprise, but also way more stable. But if you noticed, you can see that even with an X3D CPU, you can see differences in this game, with 6400 CL32 with improved subtimings delivering 4% better performance. But to be honest, this is something that you wouldn't notice unless you were benchmarking like I did here. My opinion, just pick the cheapest 6000 CL30 kit. As for the Riftbreaker, we're using the CPU benchmark with the latest game version, and the results are more within what we've seen before with the Ryzen 7 9700X. The increased frequency does help a bit of course, but the biggest performance difference is when using improved subtimings, especially when it comes to 1% lows. Also, even with DDR5 5600 you're able to achieve 177 average FPS, which is more than enough for 99% of people. When using an X3D CPU like the Ryzen 9 7900 X3D, things, as expected, are different, with the performance differences being virtually null and every single result being within the margin of error. So yes, another game where RAM doesn't really matter for the X3D CPUs. Hitman 3 is also quite CPU dependent if we go into the inbuilt benchmarks, but I wanted to test a real gameplay scenario where we had lots of NPCs like the mission called the Finish Line. And the improved subtimings with DDR5 6000 delivered 10% performance increase, with the DDR5 6200 delivering 12% performance increase, which is great when we're talking about numbers and percentages, but in the real world, yeah, the CPU is already getting you at least 219 average FPS in the scenario, with the lowest available RAM and at 1440p, so you know. And RAM becomes even more meaningless with the Ryzen 9 7900 X3D that once again delivers all results within the margin of error and at over 250 average FPS. Need for Speed Unbound is another title that has heavy CPU requirements in a matter of core count for smoothness and overall CPU power. And with the Ryzen 7 9700X, we can see the improved subtimings being one more time the major player when it comes to high FPS numbers, with the tweaked CL32 being 6% faster than the non-tweaked one. At 1440p we are more or less GPU bottlenecked, but even there we can see the improved subtimings delivering better 1% lows. And that also happens with the Ryzen 9 7900 X3D that usually delivers a bit better performance with improved subtimings, but nothing really relevant per se. PUBG is another title that people still play a lot, and if you have a non-X3D CPU like the Ryzen 7 9700X, you can know that if you want to play this game at anything below 300 average FPS, then even this CPU with 5600 CL32 RAM, which is the lowest configuration, would be more than enough. If you want to push the FPS a bit further though, overclocking your DDR5 6000 kit to let's say 6200 with improved subtimings and tweak the FCLK can deliver up to 12% performance on top of that, with the biggest difference being of course with a 20% improvement in the 1% lows. As for the Ryzen 9 7900 X3D, we have an interesting result here. As usual, the differences were very small across all RAM frequencies and timings, with the higher frequencies and lower timings having slightly better 1% lows, but again, nothing different, but with the FCLK at 2133 MHz delivering better results. I don't really know why exactly, but the FCLK overclock was even noticeable at 1440p, delivering much better 1% lows at both resolutions. Very interesting. Fortnite, on the other hand, uses Unreal Engine 5, which is quite GPU heavy, and even at high settings and over 200 FPS, the performance differences were very small at 1080p, and of course, basically non-existent at 1440p. And this is with the Ryzen 7 9700X, because as soon as we move to the Ryzen 9 7900 X3D, the differences in average FPS are basically all within the margin of error, with the only thing improving with better RAM configurations being the 1% lows. But again, nothing really life-changing, I would say. The Last of Us Part 2 is another CPU-intensive title that gets GPU bottlenecked even at around 150 FPS, which is way more than most people will use for single-player games, especially if not using frame generation, which kind of ignores the CPU bottlenecks. Unexpectedly, the results are quite on par with each other on the Ryzen 7 9700X, and strangely, even though we're kind of GPU bottlenecked, the Ryzen 9 7900 X3D delivers slightly lower FPS than the 9700X, strangely delivering up to 10 FPS less at 1440p, even though it was GPU bottlenecked in both scenarios with the same drivers, everything the same. Really interesting to see actually. Maybe it has something to do with new instructions on the 9000 series, an architectural change, I don't really know, but definitely interesting. And the last game tested is The Witcher 3, where we go back to the normal results. where going from DDR5 6000 to 6200 made no difference, but tweaking the subtimings did. In this case, by 11% at 1080p and only 5% at 1440p, since we were getting more GPU bottlenecked. With the Ryzen 9 7900 X3D, as in most cases the results are all within the margin of error, and this happens because the cache inside the CPU is kind of compensating, not needing to speak with the RAM as often as it did with lower amounts of cache. Moving now to ray tracing and back with the Ryzen 7 9700X, this is the second time that we see the FCLK Overclock doing anything meaningful, the first time being with PUBG and now with ray tracing in The Witcher 3. But only when you're over 90-95 FPS. Also, it is interesting to note that the DDR5 5600 configuration performed now quite slower than the DDR5 6000, and the tweaked subtimings didn't really do much. And they do even less with the Ryzen 9 7900 X3D, as we have way more cache and we're kind of hitting a GPU bottleneck here, even at 1080p. I mean, it is what it is. As for the 16 games average, we can see that the RAM performance differences are now quite smaller than they were in the past, with DDR5 6200 CL32 with improved subtimings and overclocked Infinity Fabric, FCLK, delivering only 9% better performance than the weakest DDR5 5600 CL32 configuration, even less if we go into more GPU-bound scenarios. I mean, even the tweaked subtimings configuration of DDR5 6000 can achieve very close numbers to 6200, so it is kind of irrelevant, I would say. As for the Ryzen 9 7900 X3D, the RAM difference is overall null, with a mere 2% improvement from the slowest to the fastest configuration, with even the 1% lows only being improved by 6%, which in my opinion isn't really worth your money, nor the time spent to trying to tweak your RAM subtimings. Well, at least now you know. And well guys, that's all for today's video. Thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe and share this video. Hope you enjoyed the explanation, hope you enjoyed the benchmarks, and let me know. I was going to say let me know. And leave a comment in the comment section telling us, the community, what's your experience with RAM frequency, which games do you play, if RAM frequency does affect the game that you play more than timings. And by the way, if you want to make the same thing with timings that I did here in terms of subtimings, go to the video in the description, link will be there for the Buildzoids tutorial on how to DDR5 overclock. That works for basically almost every single DDR RAM kit that you have out there, DDR5. And as Buildzoid says, you just need to copy the subtimings, skip your main timings, copy those subtimings, and as you saw for CPUs with no 3D cache, it makes a lot of difference. Thank you very much once again and see you in the next video. Cheers.